It was a day that many had been eagerly waiting for, the official visit of President Donald Trump to the United Kingdom. The world's eyes were on the event and tensions were high. For most people, it was a moment of celebration, a chance to witness a significant diplomatic event between two powerful nations. The President of the United States was meeting with the Queen of England, and with such a historic occasion came the ceremonial rituals that would be held in her honor. As the grand event began, the royal traditions were on full display. The British Royal Guard, the famed soldiers dressed in their iconic red coats and black bearskin hats, stood in their usual stiff formation. They were a symbol of British tradition, discipline, and pride. The crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle knew that these guards would remain completely unmoving, no matter the circumstances. This was part of the Royal Guard's reputation: stoic, unflappable, and entirely focused on their duty. Donald Trump, a figure known for his unpredictable and often controversial behavior, was in the spotlight for the first time during this visit. As he made his way through the grand gates of Buckingham Palace, the crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered for his arrival, while others expressed their disapproval. But all eyes were on him as he stepped into the royal grounds. The atmosphere was electric, and there was a certain sense of anticipation. Would Trump respect the long-standing traditions of the British monarchy, or would he bring his trademark boldness to this historic occasion? As Trump walked along the red carpet, flanked by British officials, he appeared confident and unshaken, just as he always did in public appearances. But this time he was not on his home turf. He was in a land with a rich history, a land where centuries of tradition and decorum had been carefully upheld by the royal family and its servants. The Royal Guard, for instance, had been standing sentinel at Buckingham Palace for centuries, an institution deeply embedded in British culture. They were, in the eyes of many, symbols of strength, resilience, and duty. Despite the imposing figure of the Royal Guard, Trump's demeanor was anything but respectful. As he neared them, the crowd fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. It was an intense moment, a moment filled with unspoken expectations. Would Trump, known for his bold remarks and unpredictable behavior, act respectfully in this sacred setting? Or would he attempt to challenge the very traditions that had been carefully built over centuries? With a small, almost playful smirk on his face, Trump took a glance at the Royal Guard. It was clear that he did not intend to be intimidated by the formality of the situation. Instead, he seemed to want to push the boundaries, to test the limits of what he could get away with. The Guard, as expected, did not move an inch. They were, after all, the epitome of professionalism and discipline. Trump, however, wasn't one to back down easily. He took another step closer to the Guard, then made a remark that caught many off guard. It wasn't particularly loud, but it was enough to be heard by those around him. With his signature blunt style, Trump said something that to many seemed to question the very nature of the Royal Guard's rigid posture. "It must be tiring standing there all day," he commented with a slight chuckle. His words weren't insulting, but they were certainly meant to challenge the idea that the Guard's role was one of serious duty. They were, in his view, perhaps nothing more than a show, a grand spectacle designed to impress tourists and keep up appearances. The audience, many of whom had never seen such a bold and brash comment directed at the Royal Guard, held their breath. The moment felt strangely tense. There had been rumors leading up to this visit that Trump, known for his sharp tongue and sometimes controversial remarks, might not fully respect the traditions of his hosts. But now, with those words, it seemed he had just made the first move in a silent, unspoken contest of wills. The Royal Guard, true to their nature, didn't flinch. Not even a muscle twitched in response to Trump's comment. They remained absolutely still, their faces frozen in stoic expressions. The contrast between Trump's lively, almost cocky presence and the immovable stance of the Royal Guard couldn't have been more apparent. In a way, the Guard had already won simply by doing nothing. They were unbothered, unshaken, and unfazed by his words. They had been trained for this moment, to stand tall in the face of any adversity, whether it be harsh weather, the sounds of the crowd, or, as in this case, the provocation of a world leader. But Trump wasn't one to back down easily, especially when it came to making a statement. His eyes darted briefly toward the soldiers, assessing their stillness. There was something almost defiant in his posture as he stood there, sizing up the Guard. Perhaps he was hoping for a reaction. some small sign that he had gotten under their skin. But as the seconds ticked by, it became increasingly clear that the royal guard was not going to give him the satisfaction. The crowd, which had been holding its breath in anticipation, began to murmur quietly. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, unsure of how the situation would unfold. Others whispered to each other, commenting on the oddity of the moment. Trump, after all, was famous for getting reactions from people, whether through his humor or his aggressive style. But the royal guard was different. They weren't ordinary people who could be swayed by words or gestures. They had a duty, and they would see it through no matter what. As the tension in the air thickened, the eyes of the world seemed to focus entirely on this moment. Every gesture, every word, every tiny movement was under scrutiny. Journalists from across the globe had been waiting for something, anything, that would capture the essence of this encounter. Would Trump's brashness win the day, or would the royal guard's unwavering discipline prove to be the true strength? For a few more moments, nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its collective breath as Trump stood there, perhaps waiting for the guard to break their silence. But it didn't happen. The royal guard remained as they always had, completely still, completely focused. They weren't playing a game, and they certainly weren't concerned with engaging in any kind of back and forth with Trump. Their mission was simple: to protect, to serve, and to represent the deep-rooted traditions of the British monarchy. Trump's attempted jab had failed, and in its place stood an eerie silence. The standoff between the two forces, one representing the world of tradition and the other, the unpredictable power of modern politics, was far from over. But for now at least, it seemed that the royal guard had won the first round without saying a single word. The president had tried to challenge them, but instead he found himself facing a display of power in the form of absolute calm. The silence that followed Trump's comment was almost deafening. As the crowd continued to watch, it became clear that Trump's attempt to provoke any kind of reaction from the royal guard had failed. The guards remained perfectly still, like statues carved from marble, their faces frozen in expressionless calm. Trump's sharp remark had gone unanswered, and it was clear to everyone watching that he would not get the rise he was hoping for. In a way, this was an unexpected twist. The crowd had anticipated some kind of drama, a spark that would ignite the situation. After all, Trump was known for pushing boundaries, stirring up controversy, and making bold statements. So when he had made his comment about the guard's stance, it seemed like the perfect setup for some kind of exchange, something that would add fuel to the already intense atmosphere. But instead, he was met with nothing but stone-faced discipline. The royal guard, as always, were a symbol of unwavering resolve. For a moment, Trump seemed to stand there, unsure of what to do next. His eyes flicked from the immobile soldiers to the surrounding crowd. There was no visible frustration on his face, but there was a certain tension in the air that couldn't be ignored. Everyone could sense that he was used to being in control, used to commanding attention, and here, for the first time in a long time, he found himself in a situation where his usual tactics just weren't working. But Trump wasn't one to back down easily. If he had learned one thing over his career, it was that persistence often led to success, even if the path was unconventional. He was determined to make his presence known, and he had no intention of letting the moment slip away without getting some kind of reaction. The royal guard's disciplined silence only seemed to encourage him further, pushing him to dig in his heels and keep going. Trump took a few steps closer to the guard. The crowd could feel the tension building. His every movement seemed to send a ripple through the audience, and eyes turned from the immobile soldiers to him, watching to see what he would do next. He wasn't going to walk away just yet. He wasn't going to let this moment pass without trying to make it his own. With another small chuckle, Trump turned toward one of the guards directly in front of him and casually raised an eyebrow. The guards remained as they had before, motionless, unfazed. Trump's actions were becoming more deliberate now, almost as if he were daring them to break character, to show even a hint of emotion. He wanted to see if they would crack, if he could expose some weakness in their legendary discipline. But they didn't. They didn't budge, didn't blink, and didn't react in the slightest. For some reason, this only seemed to amuse him more. A slight grin appeared on his face as he looked at the guard standing in front of him. He was determined to push further. There was something almost theatrical in the way he stood there now, sizing up the guards as though they were actors in a play, and he was the director, trying to get them to break character. The more still they remained, the more his need to get a reaction grew. But it wasn't just Trump's actions that kept the crowd on edge. The Royal Guard's complete composure made the scene even more intriguing. They had faced countless situations like this before, but each time they showed nothing. No smile, no hint of irritation, no shift in posture. They were the definition of professionalism. Whether it was a curious tourist trying to get their attention, or in this case, a world leader trying to make a point, they would not move. Their duty was clear, and it was bigger than any single moment of provocation. The crowd watched intently, the air thick with anticipation. Some were silently rooting for Trump, hoping to see him win some kind of victory over the seemingly untouchable Royal Guard. Others were eager to see if the Guard would finally break, if just a crack would appear in their unyielding facade. And still there were those who simply admired the stoicism of the soldiers. To them, this was a moment that highlighted something far more important, a quiet but powerful message about discipline, duty, and control. As the minutes passed, Trump seemed to realize that his earlier remarks hadn't had the desired effect. The Guard wasn't flinching. They weren't playing his game. The more he tried to push, the more obvious it became that the Royal Guard's silence was a force in itself. They weren't going to play into his hands. They weren't interested in a back and forth. They had a job to do, and that was all that mattered. Despite the deadlock, Trump wasn't about to give up just yet. His instincts told him that if he didn't make something happen now, he would lose the opportunity to shape the narrative. So he changed tactics. Instead of trying to get the Guard to react with words, he turned his attention to their posture, their stillness. He walked along the line of soldiers, eyeing each one as he passed. With each step, the tension in the air seemed to rise, as if everyone was waiting for the Guard to finally crack. The audience was now fully engaged, watching with bated breath as the standoff continued. But still, nothing. At this point, it was clear that the Guards were masters of their craft. No matter how close Trump got, no matter how much he tried to engage them, they remained utterly unaffected. It wasn't just about standing still physically. It was about mental control. The Royal Guard didn't just have the ability to remain still. They had the ability to completely ignore everything happening around them. Trump's attempts to throw them off balance had been futile, and now it seemed like the only thing left for him to do was to walk away. But even in this moment of apparent failure, there was a shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't that Trump had lost, but rather that the Royal Guard had succeeded in a way that no one had expected. By doing absolutely nothing, they had won. They had taken control of the situation without lifting a finger. They had shown that discipline and professionalism were stronger than any kind of provocation. Trump, for all his power and influence, was left with nothing. His usual strategies, his sharp tongue, his ability to dominate conversations, had no effect here. He had tried, and failed, to provoke a reaction. The Royal Guard had won the battle of wills simply by remaining composed. In that moment, it became clear to the crowd, and to the watching world, that sometimes the greatest form of strength is the ability to do nothing at all. As Trump walked away, perhaps with a sense of confusion or frustration, it was evident that the story had already been written. The world had witnessed an incredible display of discipline, one that would go down in history as a reminder of the power of calm in the face of challenge. It wasn't a victory achieved by words or action. It was a victory achieved by silence and control. And for the Royal Guard, that was more than enough. As the scene continued to unfold, there was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere. Trump had spent several moments trying to provoke a reaction from the Royal Guard, but they had not budged an inch. The world watched in anticipation, expecting something to happen, but the stoic silence of the Guard seemed almost too powerful to ignore. They were like unmoving statues, their faces fixed in an expression of utter calm, as though nothing, not even the most brash provocation from the President of the United States, could disturb them. For a brief moment, it seemed like the situation had reached a standstill. Trump, usually so confident in his ability to command attention and stir up reactions, was now faced with an unexpected challenge: the Royal Guard's incredible self-discipline. But Trump, being who he was, didn't take kindly to being outplayed. He wasn't about to let the Guard steal the spotlight. With a determined look on his face, Trump began to strategize. He realized that if his words couldn't break the guard's concentration, he would have to try something else. It wasn't just about making a bold statement anymore. It was about winning the moment, controlling the narrative. He wasn't going to let the world think that his bravado had been useless, or that the royal guard had bested him without a single word. Trump's eyes scanned the row of guards, each one standing tall and silent. His eyes narrowed, and for a moment it seemed as though he was contemplating his next move. There was a certain intensity in his gaze, as though he had already decided that this time he would get a reaction, no matter what it took. He knew the eyes of the world were on him. This was more than just a standoff in front of Buckingham Palace. It was a battle for control, for dominance. If he could get just one of the guards to move, to shift, to show any sign of vulnerability, it would be a victory. He would have proven that even the most disciplined soldiers could be broken. But the Royal Guard wasn't like the people Trump was used to dealing with. They weren't ordinary soldiers. They were the embodiment of centuries-old traditions, trained for years to maintain perfect composure no matter the situation. They had been through countless encounters, tourists who tried to make them laugh, people who took photos with them, and even some who attempted to engage in conversation. Yet through it all, the guards had never faltered. They were the epitome of duty, and nothing, not even Trump's attempts to provoke them, would change that. Trump stepped closer again, his eyes fixed on one particular guard who was standing in the front. He walked along the line of soldiers slowly, deliberately. As he moved, he noticed the smallest of details: the perfect alignment of their uniforms, the precision of their posture. But most striking of all was their stillness. The more he looked at them, the more he realized just how deep their discipline ran. It wasn't something that could be shaken by a few words or a sharp gesture. This was their world, their training, and they were prepared for whatever came their way. Despite the mounting pressure, the guards stood like statues. There was no sign of weakness, no sign of hesitation. Trump's attempts to disrupt their focus only seemed to make them more resolute. Each step he took, each word he said, seemed to slip away from them without leaving a trace. The guards were completely unfazed, unwavering in their commitment to their duty. Trump's frustration began to show. He was used to being the one in control, the one who dictated the terms of any interaction. But here, in this moment, it was as if he was the one being controlled. He had expected some kind of reaction, but the guards simply weren't giving him anything. Not a look, not a flinch, not even a shift in posture. It was as if they were completely immune to his presence. For a moment, Trump's bravado seemed to falter. He took a step back and surveyed the scene. He had come here thinking he would shake things up, that his presence alone would be enough to challenge the Royal Guard's reputation. But now, as he stood there, it was clear that he had underestimated their ability to remain completely calm under pressure. This wasn't a situation where he could force a reaction. This wasn't a situation where his words could win the day. The Royal Guard had already won, might simply by doing nothing. In that moment, something changed in the air. The tension that had built up between Trump and the guard slowly began to dissolve, replaced by something else: a quiet understanding. Trump may not have gotten the reaction he had been hoping for, but what he had witnessed was powerful in its own right. It was the power of silence, of restraint. It was a lesson in composure, something he hadn't expected from this encounter. The Royal Guard wasn't trying to make a point. They weren't interested in confrontation or drama. They were simply doing their job, and in doing it flawlessly. As Trump stood there, the realization began to sink in. He had been outmatched not by words, but by sheer discipline. The more he tried to provoke the guards, the more they remained steadfast. They were not concerned with the spectacle he was trying to create. They were beyond that. It was a humbling moment for the president, one that he might not have fully understood at the time, but one that would stick with him for a long while. But even in the face of this humbling moment, Trump was not one to back down easily. His nature was to fight back, to push for what he wanted, to never admit defeat. So despite the overwhelming calm of the Royal Guard, he tried once more. With a small but deliberate movement, he raised his hand, gesturing toward one of the guards as though to give them a signal. It was almost as if he was testing them, to see if they would finally show some sign of life. But the guard didn't move. They didn't even acknowledge him. Trump's hand remained in the air, but there was no response. It was as though the guards were immune to his tactics, immune to his attempts to draw them into his game. They were standing their ground, and they weren't going to be swayed. Trump dropped his hand, his expression hardening. The realization was now fully clear. No matter what he did, the royal guard wouldn't break. And in that moment, it became abundantly clear that the guard's strength wasn't in their physical presence, but in their ability to remain undisturbed by the world around them. They were untouchable, and the more Trump pushed, the more he realized he could not win this battle. For the royal guard, it wasn't about making a statement. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about the quiet, steadfast dedication to duty, a dedication that had stood the test of time. In that stillness, they had already won. The world had witnessed their strength, and it had come not from loud words or flashy gestures, but from the power of calm, focused discipline.